Well, we finally arrived at the macromolecules lesson. I love this lesson because it's when all the little bits of chemistry we've been learning literally start to get put together. So what are we putting together anyway? Well, we're putting together organic compounds or organic molecules. These compounds have covalent carbon-hydrogen bonds, so that's going to include almost every carbon-containing compound on the planet. It'll be classified as organic. The exception is carbon dioxide because there is no hydrogen in CO2. Organic compounds are built by living things and they're built for living things, so they are a huge component of our study of biology, although generally you're not going to see a lot of, like we've talked about, you're not going to see a lot of those metal atoms, those very large atoms here in these macromolecules. So I keep using the term molecule and compound. So what's the difference? Well, let's clear that up. Well, a molecule is two or more atoms put together. So that'd be like oxygen. A compound includes two or more different elements. So that could be something like methane. So all of the macromolecules contain more than one element and also more than one atom. So they're going to be both considered molecules and compounds. So the macromolecules, they are macro, meaning big, molecules. They have a very high molecular mass, and to achieve that, you normally have to build them from smaller subunits. And so those small subunits are called monomers. The large units that they're going to be built into are called polymers. So mono meaning one, poly meaning many. And so what you'll often see them pictured as, when this is simplified, is something like beads on a string, where the beads are the monomers and the string holding them together represents the covalent bonds. We're going to be studying four major groups of macromolecules. The first is the carbohydrates, also called polysaccharides. They're built from something called a monosaccharide. The second, lipids, built from glycerol and fatty acids. The third, proteins, also called polypeptides, and those are built not from peptides, but peptide bonds are a part of it, but they're monomers, the amino acids. And then finally we have the nucleic acids, examples of them, the big ones, DNA and RNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, ribonucleic acid, and they are built from nucleotides. These monomers are generally linked together through a process called a condensation reaction, which is also known as dehydration synthesis, because you're going to remove water in order to form a covalent bond. And so there again are the four macromolecules we're going to be looking at, and here is a condensation reaction. So we have a glycerol here, and there's a big fatty acid, although really it would be even longer than that, but I ran out of room. And so you can see, if you watch closely, that hydrogen and hydroxyl group, I'll go back, hydrogen and hydroxyl group, they are going to become water. Water is going to leave the party. And the fatty acid is going to be bonded to the glycerol. Now, covalent bond. And if that happens two more times, you'll have 3 fatty acids attached to 1 glycerol. You'll end up with 3 water molecules, but of course those are pretty, unimportant because this is all happening in an already aqueous, water-rich environment, but we did create 3 waters, and what we formed, the big molecule here, is a triglyceride. Condensation reactions require energy, lots of energy input. This is an anabolic process. We'll learn more about that later. And often those processes, especially in living things, are going to require enzymes. Also more on that later. The opposite of a condensation reaction is hydrolysis or hydrolysis, literally meaning to break apart with water. And so if your body needs to break apart monomers, that's what it'll generally use. But we're talking about making the macromolecules right now, so we're talking about the condensation reactions. As I go over each of the 4 macromolecules, I want you to pay special attention to what function they play in the body, what their structure or any special structural designations they have. What are the elements involved? Be looking out for that. We'll summarize at the end. And any special bond types or names given to the covalent bonds. They're all going to be covalent bonds. When we're talking about linking the macromolecules together, but sometimes their shape comes from some special bonds that are occurring later on after the monomers have been linked together. So look out for that, and look out for examples of each of the macromolecules. So we're first going to go over carbohydrates. Most of you are familiar with the carbohydrates in our food. Starches, like in a potato, sugars, like in sucrose, table sugar. But they're also a huge part of cell walls, both in bacteria, fungi, and plants. So they are a support system as well as food. To us, that structural support for a plant is basically fiber. So we can store little bits of energy as a carbohydrate. Plants can store a lot more. Obviously, potato is just energy that potato plant is storing. But for us, we can't keep a lot of energy in a carbohydrate because it's the first thing we're going to burn when we generate ATP through cellular respiration. There are more efficient ways to store energy long term. Carbohydrate is a very short-term thing, and it's the first thing to be consumed during cellular respiration. So this is to humans, we think carbohydrate, we think energy. So the monosaccharides, they are the simplest sugars, actually. Sometimes we call them simple sugars, and their ratio is 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. So that could be as simple as C1H2O1, but normally you're going to see it as something like a glucose, C6H12O6. And our examples here, here is a glucose. And so you can see, if you look at all the corners of that molecule, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 corners, plus the corner occupied by oxygen, plus 1 more carbon up top. That gives you 6 carbons, and you could go through and count the hydrogens and the oxygens as well. And you should get C6H12O6 because that is a glucose. Disaccharides are 2 simple sugars minus a water because it's gone through 1 condensation reaction. And all these examples involve glucose. So sucrose is glucose and fructose, maltose has 2 glucose, and lactose has a galactose with it. One common theme you should be picking out here is that all the sugars end in OSE. They're all ose. So if you see something that you've never seen before, and it's not one of these examples I've given you, but it ends in ose, that's a really good indicator that it is also a monosaccharide or a disaccharide, and it's a sugar. Polysaccharides do both the main jobs of carbohydrates. They are both structural or they're energy storage related. So the big energy storage ones, if you look at their orientation and where those hydroxyl groups are, look at this, I've highlighted it for you. They're all on one side of the molecule, the way those links are formed. So starch, we can obviously break down. You know about potato starches and starches in bread. Glycogen is the form of polysaccharide our bodies make to store some carbohydrates. So when you carb load before an athletic event, what you're trying to do is maximize how much glycogen is stored, especially in your muscle tissues, so that you have that accessible and ready to go when you run your race or play your football game. That's where your energy is coming from first and foremost. Cellulose found in plant cell walls and the chitin found in fungal cell walls. If you look at how they're arranged, their hydroxyl groups, it's flipped, every other one. So the orientation is different, and that makes it very difficult for our bodies. We don't have the enzymes to break those bonds. So cellulose is a major component of dietary fiber. That makes it very good for the plants if their cell walls aren't able to be readily broken down by enzymes. You can see the advantage there, so it should make some common sense.